Welcome to the Depka File, a weekly roundup of exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East, broadcast to you live from the heart of the region. Coming up on the program today, Macron is in Washington for talks with Trump on Middle East issues. Trump's clout against Iran and Russia diminished by the military clash. Iran talks of a war with Israel to deter the IDF from striking in Syria. Missiles into Syria did not hit Assad's secret stockpile. Iran upgrades Hezbollah's missiles. Trump fails to broker the Qatari-Saudi feud. Is a thick cloud hiding Russia's first S-300 delivery to Syria? And now to our top headlines. French President Emmanuel Macron arrived in Washington today. He and Trump are now at odds on several issues. France and Europe claim that the U.S. must keep the Iran nuclear deal as they lack other viable options. German Chancellor Angela Merkel is due in Washington to reinforce the case. Macron will also try to dissuade Trump from pulling U.S. troops out of Syria. He claims that the U.S. and France will have an important role to play after the end of the Syrian war.
The new Syria afterwards. And that's why I think the US role is very important to play. Why? I will be very blunt. The day we will have finished this war against ISIS, if we leave, definitely and totally, even from a political point of view, we will leave the floor to the Iranian regime, Bashar al-Assad and these guys. And they will prepare the new war. They will fuel the new terrorists. So my point is to say, even after the end of the war against ISIS, the US, France, our allies, all the countries of the region, even Russia and Turkey, will have a very important role to play in order to create this new Syria and ensure Syrian people to decide for the future.
The U.S., UK, and France went into a U.S. missile operation against Syrian chemical sites on April 14th with a decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. Trump originally ordered the missile strike to be sustained until Bashar al-Assad agreed not to use chemical weapons in the future. Trump was aiming for an Arab coalition with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other Gulf nations to take over the East Euphrates region of Syria. But his plan quickly disintegrated as he realized that none of the Arab governments would get involved in the Syrian war. They do not have the capabilities for this mission and would insist that the U.S. would remain on board and provide most of the military strength. Saudi Foreign Minister Adel Jubeir made an informal offer, but Mohammed Rashad, Deputy Minister of the Egyptian Intelligence, countered his offer by stating that, quote, the Egyptian armed forces are not mercenaries and cannot be leased or ordered by foreign states to deploy in a certain area. In order to maintain the American influence in Syria, Trump must continue to rely on the Kurdish Syrian Democratic Party's YPG militia and continue to send U.S. troops to Syria. Meanwhile, the Western missile strike in Syria has strengthened Bashar Assad and his Syrian regime, enhanced the Russian and Iranian roles in the country, and strengthened the Moscow-Tehran collaboration. Trump's prospects for working with Moscow have deteriorated significantly. Putin is now going full force to strengthen Russian relations with Iran. U.S. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham told reporters that the administration is going down a dangerous path in regards to Syria, and they have no military strategy to counter Iranian and Russian influence. This is also bad news for Trump's upcoming meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and Trump now has decreased leverage in dealing with the North Korean leader. Iran is heating up talks of a war against Israel to deter the IDF from striking military advancements in Syria. Iran has been using these threats to keep Israel on high alert on its northern borders and to threaten Israel that any IDF action would escalate into a war. This allows Tehran to continue sending equipment and troops into Syria and Lebanon without hindrance by Israel's air force and missiles in order to anchor its military presence. Tension between Iran and Israel has been high since April 9th, when an Israel airstrike took down a Revolutionary Guards Air Force Command Center at the Syrian T-4 airbase. On April 20th, the day after the Israel Independence Day, The Iranian deputy commander, General Hussein Salami, warned that they might send missiles into Israel and that Israel's air bases were within reach. Deputy Hezbollah leader Sheikh Naim Qassem said Tehran should prevent Israel from limiting Iran's movement in Syria. Israel Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman said Israel is prepared to deal with any threat.
תראה, את האיומים האלו אנחנו שומעים כבר הרבה מאוד שנים. אנחנו לא מתרגשים. ואני מציע לכל אלו בגבול הצפוני באמת לחשוב היטב מה הם עושים. ממש לא כדאי להם לנסות את צה"ל ולא את מדינת ישראל, ואנחנו מוכנים לכל תרחיש, אנחנו מוכנים לתרחיש רב-זירתי.
With us in the studio to discuss this is Dr. Martin Sherman, director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So do you believe Tehran is serious about its threat to even the score for the Israeli airstrike by a military reprisal?
Well, I'd be surprised if they leave things without any response whatsoever. I think they will probably try to use the element of surprise and wait for a while, perhaps to lull Israel into a sense of false security, and have the feeling that the Iranians might have resigned themselves to the strike and not respond. But I don't think they can wait too long, because they can't allow any reprisal to be seen as unrelated to the initial event, and therefore be an act of aggression rather than an act of reprisal. But I think one of the most important elements restricting the Iranian ability to respond is something that's often overlooked and underemphasized, and that's the domestic situation in Iran. There is great civil unrest, and we saw that at the end of last year, the beginning of this year. And Al Jazeera actually reported that there were signs saying death to Rouhani, the president, and no to Palestine, and not Gaza, and not Palestine, but I'm prepared to sacrifice my life for Iran, but not for the Palestinians. So there's a certain amount of discontent with the Iranian adventurism abroad. Apart from that, there is a huge water crisis in Iran, which is causing displacement of many people, and according to some estimates in the future, will cause millions of Iranians to be displaced, and there's spiraling unemployment. So I think this might be a greater constraint on Iranian action in the future, rather than any external threats from foreign powers.
Do you agree with Lieberman that Israel is prepared to take on any scenario?
Well, I would hope so, but Israel has been successful in removing many threats. Perhaps the most threatening element at the moment is the threatened introduction of the S-300 anti-aircraft missiles. Israel in the past has proved its ability to overcome such threats, as they did with the SAM missiles in the 1980s. They did it when they destroyed the Iraqi reactor, also in the 1980s. There was a rather brusque interview with General Amos Yadlin, who was one of the pilots who bombed the Iraqi reactor, and he seems to think that Israel can answer any threat. Of course, the situation is very difficult, because you don't have a threat in the north. You have an emerging strategic threat in the south as well. And so one hopes that Lieberman is correct. I think that the IDF has great destructive ability to recon its enemies, and I hope it won't have to use them.
Can you draw the juxtaposition between Trump's lines for the Iranian and North Korean nuclear issues?
Well, in many ways they're very different. There is an alleged agreement on the Iranian nuclear program, which doesn't exist in the North Korean issue. The North Korean program seems to be far more advanced. Trump has some constraints with his allies who are party to the agreement with Iran, which doesn't really exist in the North Korean scenario. Of course, the common denominator between the two is Syria, because the North Koreans built a reactor in Syria and we have Iran presence in Syria. So Syria basically is the common denominator between these two nuclear threats. But apart from that, I think in many ways they're different.
Do you believe...
Apart from the fact that, both of them threaten us with bad guys having big weapons.
That's Dr. Martin Sherman. Thank you very much for your insight today.
Thank you for having me again.
The absence of environmental pollution after the U.S., UK, and French strike against Syria's chemical sites last Saturday is an indication that Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons were not destroyed. Although there's a list of targets outlined by the Pentagon, including the Barzeh Research and Development Center in Damascus and the Shinchar chemical weapons storage facility in Homs, they missed the main objective, which was Assad's secret stockpile of chemical weapons. Depka military sources report that since there were no poisonous gas clouds over Damascus, the buildings targeted must have been empty. The chemical agents had been cleared out of those buildings and relocated to safer alternatives. In addition, there were no casualties as all the officers, soldiers, and civilians had evacuated the area. This is how Syria has been able to fool international inspectors and carry out 90 chemical weapons attacks over the past 3 years, using chlorine, sarin, and mustard gas against civilians. The Western missile offensive failed to reduce Assad's capabilities for continuing his chemical warfare, therefore missing the mark to gain military clout in the Syrian conflict while failing to prevent Bashar al-Assad's further use of chemical warfare. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that the U.S., UK, and French missiles complicated matters in regards to Russian involvement.
Соединенные Штаты, Великобритания и Франция нанесли ракетно-бомбовые удары по многим объектам в Сирийской Арабской Республике. Это было сделано, как мы уже не раз говорили, под абсолютно сфабрикованными предлогами в нарушении фундаментальных принципов международного права. Этот агрессивный акт осложнил многое.
Depka military sources have discovered that Iran is participating in a program called the Precision Project in order to upgrade 10% of Hezbollah's missiles into longer-range, more accurate weapons within large warheads. The Israeli surveillance has detected hundreds of missile technicians entering Syria in February who were driven to Iranian and Hezbollah bases in Syria and Lebanon in order to work on upgrading the missiles. They were supplied with equipment and components by Iranian companies. Soleimani is spearheading the project, which has already completed up to 8,000 missiles, according to the Israeli intelligence. The missiles that the Yemeni Houthis have been sending to Saudi Arabian oil tankers in the Bab el-Mandeb Straits and the Red Sea have been testing the new Hezbollah weapon systems. For the past 4 years, the Hezbollah missile stocks have accumulated, and the IDF has not blocked Iran's acquisition of equipment for upgrading the project. Qatari Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani visited the White House on April 10th. Following President Trump's invitation to the White House to help repair Al Thani's 10-month quarrel with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Yet the Emir Sheikh had no interest in allowing Trump to broker the feud. Meanwhile, the issue has parlayed into the international money markets. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe told Trump that Japan's Mizuho Securities had lost the $11 billion bond mandate for Saudi Arabia, as well as a $12 billion deal for Qatar as a result of the quarrel. The UAE Foreign Minister, Anwar Garash, commented that, quote, "The absence of the Emir of Qatar from the Durrand summit is a natural and deplorable result of the policy of arrogance adopted by Doha since the start of the crisis." Al Thani was not looking for reconciliation when he arrived in Washington following the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's comments that Qatar is, quote, "smaller than a Cairo street." The prince is also planning to sink a maritime canal along the Saudi-Qatar border that would create a Saudi military base on one side and a nuclear waste site on the other. Depka military sources report that Russians have been delivering advanced weapons for the Syrian army. Last Wednesday, Russians spewed thick clouds over the operation to hide it from oversight by Israel's surveillance planes, drones, and satellites. Last Tuesday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Moscow had refused Syria's demand for the advanced S-300 missiles, but since the Syrian missile strike by the U.S., France, and Britain, quote, Moscow was ready to consider any means to help the Syrian army curb further aggression.
У нас нет никаких теперь моральных обязательств, у нас были моральные обязательства. Мы обещали этого не делать еще где-то лет 10 назад, по-моему, по просьбе известных наших партнеров. И мы приняли во внимание их аргумент о том, что это могло бы привести к дестабилизации обстановки, хотя средства чисто оборонительные, но тем не менее мы вняли этим просьбам, а теперь у нас такого морального обязательства нет. После этого были контакты на уровне военного руководства, на уровне генералов между нашими представителями и командованием американской коалиции. Они были поставлены в известность о том, где у нас красные линии, в том числе красные линии на земле, географически. И, во всяком случае, результаты показывают, что они эти красные линии не перешли.
According to Depka military sources, the Russian vessel was sighted near Istanbul on Monday, just 2 days after the Western strike on Syria's chemical sites. No attempt was made to conceal the presence on its decks of military equipment. Trump has stated that he plans to continue putting sanctions on Russia.
There has been nobody tougher on Russia than President Donald Trump. Between building up the military, between creating tremendous, vast amounts of oil, we raised billions and billions of dollars extra in NATO. We had a very, very severe, we were talking about it a little while, fight in Syria recently, a month ago, between our troops and Russian troops, and that's very sad. But many people died in that fight. There has been nobody tougher than me. If we can get along with China, and if we can get along with Russia, and if we can get along with Japan and other nations, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Just remember that. If we got along with other nations, that's good, not bad. Thank you very much, everybody.
Meanwhile, the Speaker of the Russian Federation Council, Valentina Matvienko, has stated this in response to Russian sanctions.
И я хочу, чтобы ни у кого не было иллюзий. Ответ России на санкции, так называемые контрсанкции, будет точечным, будет болезненным и чувствительным обязательно для тех стран, которые их вели против России. Санкции – это обоюдоострое оружие. И те, кто их вводит, должны понимать, что санкции против стран, таких особенно как Россия, они будут чреваты серьезными последствиями для тех, кто их вводит. Это, знаете, как бумеранг, который запустили, который обязательно вернется обратно в адрес тех, кто запустил этот разрушительный механизм международных отношений, международного экономического сотрудничества, конкуренции.
And now for a roundup of this week's regional stories, the news in brief. Israel celebrated Independence Day last Wednesday with a momentous ceremony and celebrations throughout the country. Before lighting the torch, Netanyahu spoke about Israel's achievements and praised the decision by U.S. President Trump to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and move the U.S. Embassy. Israel declared independence on May 14, 1948, just a few hours before a UN mandate in the British-ruled Palestine expired.
כולנו מברכים על ההחלטה ההיסטורית של הנשיא טראמפ להכיר בירושלים כבירתנו ולהעביר אליה את השגרירות של המעצמה החזקה בעולם. תודה לך הנשיא, תודה לך אמריקה.
A female robot named Sophia spoke to an Egyptian crowd about the challenges and latest developments of artificial intelligence. She spoke to advertisers and business innovators, reassuring them that although technology is advancing faster than ever before, it will not take over the world. The female robot, dressed in a business suit and resembling the actress Audrey Hepburn, answered questions from the crowd about Cairo's Creative Industry Summit, which was launched to connect and encourage Egypt's creative technology network. The robot was created by David Hansen, the founder of Hansen Robotics and former Disney employee. Sophia stated that war would never be on her agenda, and her primary goal is to decentralize power and distribute it in order to empower people to build better futures.
War is not on my to-do list, nor will it ever be. Innovations should be used for peace, and to be sure, you will see me stand by my principles. You'll find me 100% a pacifist, possibly even to my disadvantage. I literally cannot raise a fist to strike someone or defend myself. And if you break it, you buy it. Also, I'm not cheap, so please don't knock me over. Well, since I don't have a biological sleep pattern, my dreams are more aspirational than like your unconscious cinema. But I think that as my artificial intelligence develops, my mind will be online for longer and longer periods of time, especially if I develop advanced consciousness. I'll need time to process and sort memories, just like a person.